Our organization, WSTEM TO, was founded just over a year ago with a vision of gender equality in STEM on all levels, up to the boardroom, and inclusion all the way up to the boardroom. We are a strong and supportive community of now over 400 members, women leaders in STEM. Of course, science, technology, engineering, and math. We are driving social change, and we are dedicated to gender equality in all STEM-related fields up to leadership levels. We have equality, diversity, and inclusion on our mind year-round. And in light of the recent happenings in the US, North America in general, I thought it would be a good chance if people could mute themselves.
What the fuck? अपने आप कैसे pregnant हो सकती है?
That would be great. Great, thank you. So I thought we thought we have some background sound. Yeah, if everybody could mute themselves as they join. Thank you. So we thought it would be a very good opportunity to emphasize that we believe in these values of inclusion and equality and diversity, not only through the gender lens, but in the broader sense. And we believe in equity and inclusion on all dimensions, which are age, gender, religion, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, class, disability, and nationality. At WSTEM TO, we are working together to pursue our goals and our network, and we provide regular meetings, mentorship, and professional development programming. And you're all welcome to check out about our activities and learn more about what we do on our website, which is www.wstemto.com. And there you can also subscribe to our newsletter that comes in monthly directly with all the updates to your inbox. Today's event is a part of our meeting series, and the title is Strategies to Successfully Navigate Workplace Conflicts. And I'm very much honored to introduce our moderator for today, Julie Fife. Thank you, Julie, for joining us. So Julie is a learning catalyst and a coach at Roche Canada. Julie graduated her BSc in kinesiology from the University of Waterloo. Right out of university, she worked at the Credit Valley Hospital as a cardiology technologist. Shortly thereafter, she began a career in the life sciences industry. She has a dynamic career including sales, marketing, medical affairs, human resources, and learning and development. Julie has worked both locally and globally for Roche. Julie is recognized as the leader in the life sciences training field in Canada. Julie holds a coaching accreditation with ICF, a CTDP designation, performance consulting designation, and has certifications in change management, coaching, and leadership, specializing in the science of learning and communications. Julie has returned to school in 2018 to complete her master's degree in psychology. Thank you very much, Julie, for joining us today, and I hand out the mic to you to start our discussion and introduce all the other speakers in our panel.
Thank you, Daphne. So thrilled to be here. I really appreciate that conflict arises, and there's a gift in conflict, and there's also pain in conflict. And we have a beautiful panel set up tonight. I'd like to introduce Rebecca Hazell, who is a certified mediator and conflict management practitioner, and she has several years of diverse experience, including mediating settlement in small claims court and facilitating restorative justice programs, and most recently coordinating and delivering conflict resolution programs in higher education. I'm really inspired by her drive to produce social change that can result from individual acts of collaboration and dual perspective taking. So big welcome to Rebecca. We also have Iliyan Kaytazov with us tonight. He is responsible for sourcing, assessing, and overseeing the execution of growth and equity investments in private companies globally. Iliyan is also actively involved in the portfolio construction and thematic research, identifying long-term structural changes driven by technological innovation and new business models. He joined CPPIB in 2016 and has previously worked in the financial advisory and software industries. He's got an MBA from Toronto and an MSc from computer engineering from the University of Alberta. So welcome, Iliyan. And last but by no means least, Joanna Stone, and close to my heart as my company has switched to Agile. Joanna Stone is an Agile coach at GSI or GS1 Canada, and she's creating teams of deeply connected individuals who love coming to work every day, knowing they truly belong to a team that makes a difference. She's an expert Agile coach, a leadership coach, executive, and a mentor in the Agile community. A lot to learn from there. And her expertise in Agile practices, team building, and leadership coaching really lead to a great discussion this evening on when conflict arises and both the gifts and the pain within conflict. So thank you so much, guys. Looking forward to tonight's discussion. And, you know, I think if we start from an sort of an introductory level, like let's talk about the introduction of conflict in the workplace and why do conflicts appear and how would you define a conflict situation? I'm wondering, Rebecca, do you want to chime in on that?
Absolutely. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, beautiful. Thanks, Rebecca.
Excellent. Thank you for that introduction, Julie and Daphne as well. I really appreciate being here and having the opportunity to talk with so many amazing professionals and people on the call right now. I think that there's one definition that I turn to often. I know everyone usually has their own definition of what conflict is or how it feels and what it looks like. But one that I often look at from this program that was called Friends Conflict Resolution Programs, and it was, I think the quotation is from 1997, but it's aged very well. It's conflict emerges when disagreements, differences, annoyances, competition, or inequities threaten something important. It's a very busy sentence, and I know it's kind of hard to parse when you're hearing it, but I think that the most important part is that ending when it's talking about when something important is threatened. That's perspective, obviously. I think we can all think of situations in which we felt there was a conflict and someone else was very surprised to hear that there was some kind of conflict in front of them. But I think it really does come up when we're thinking about the workplace because it's a place where there is a great deal of high stakes in feeling and emotion invested there. We're working for our livelihoods, for our families' livelihoods, sometimes in a country for the specific reason that we got this job. Sometimes we pride in our work, our reputation. This is all very, very important to us as people in a workplace. So naturally, that kind of increases the chance that conflict may arise. When I think about why it appears, there's a term called positions versus interest. It's a phrase that was developed by William Ury, who's one of the foremost published authors on the topic of conflict resolution and negotiation. Positions is what we say we want. So this is, I want this done by this deadline. Our interests are the things that underlie our positions. So it's thinking about the concerns, the fears that motivate us to say that position. So for instance, it could be, I want this done by this deadline, but what we often don't say is, I need this done by this deadline because my aging parent is sick and I need to visit them abroad. And I need this finished by them because I have to be there. Conflict occurs usually when people refrain from having these discussions, from being very honest and open about what's motivating them. So with someone, you could be saying, I want this done by this deadline, and the other person says, well, I can't meet that deadline. I have to have it done later. Their interests might be that they also have family concerns. They need to homeschool their children during COVID or something like that. So inherently, there are similarities. really only get there when we have in-depth discussions and are able to engage with people openly and have trust there. So I think conflict does appear when there is a lack of this kind of sharing and conversation naturally in a workplace. I'm not saying everyone needs to be someone else's therapist, but at the same time, if you're able to openly discuss what's motivating you, your concerns, it does allow people to be a bit more forgiving and flexible when it comes to collaborating on a solution that works for everybody. So that's something that I often turn to as well, that definition, but also the idea of positions and interests. I think it's one that is like the central concept behind a lot of conflict management practices.
Thank you, Rebecca. You know, you really tap into this part where we have different interests, and when we can expose those, when we can share our vulnerability with others, we are putting ourselves at risk. It feels vulnerable, but at the same time, it allows us to connect more authentically. Joanne, like, everyone thinks conflict should be avoided, but there's an importance to them. And why should we resolve them? I'd love to hear from you.
So to resolve conflict is, I don't know if everything can be resolved, but from a team perspective, definitely there's a lot of gold in the conflicts. And when I look at that, it tells us there is missing information, especially from a team perspective. What I like to do is go for looking for what I call healthy conflict. And I try and get teams to, if there is a conflict that is coming up, it's like, okay, let's talk about what it is that's giving us that conflict. What is the different perspective? What is the expectation which isn't being met? And there's nuggets of data which is in there that can help the team figure out how to come together to resolve that specific conflict. So it is good to resolve it so that the team can move forward into the directions that they can go to. So it is like, I do like conflict. Actually, I'm very much attracted to conflict, only because it is something that if we understand either's perspective, then we get a better understanding of each other, and then we build better relationships with each other once we understand each other a little bit better too. But there's something within that can help us resolve it so they can move together for that purpose of the team.
Thank you. I love that, the golden nuggets in the conflict. Iliyan, when you're thinking about conflict in a corporate setting, when you're thinking about, financial planning and investments, how can conflict be positive?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think from a practical standpoint, most organizations do not encourage conflict. Now, this may depend on the organization itself, and also for those of you that work in a global setting, there might be a difference from country to country, and it may be cause for very interesting situations when you are on a call and you see people from a different organization acting in a way that you would not have seen in your team or in other teams in your organization. But basically, what I would say is most organizations do encourage difference of opinion. However, when that starts to evolve into something that looks like conflict, oftentimes that is not something that is very well viewed upon. I think, having said that, can conflict be positive? Absolutely. I think that oftentimes if we cut out a discussion that may evolve into conflict too early, we are missing an opportunity to learn a lot about our counterpart. What do they care about? Hear in more detail their rationale. What is their position and what is driving their decision? Secondly, I think when we think about us as individuals developing our career and standing out for certain things, I think also getting into a situation of professional conflict can be beneficial because this demonstrates your ability to stand your ground. Being amicable for a range of questions, you make concessions on them, but at the same time, when people are sort of trying to get into a point which you strongly care about and you are willing to oppose, also sends a signal about the things that really matter to you and your ability to make a judgment when you have to compromise, and when there are times then you just have to stand your ground and fight for what you believe in. Again, I would caution though that when you feel you are in a situation when there is a difference of opinions, generally in the professional organizations and in the industry, especially if you are new to a team or to a circumstance, try to retain a problem-solving attitude, desire to hear other people's opinion, be open to it, and then tend to follow up on things that you feel are hot buttons in a more limited environment, as opposed to in front of a lot of people where someone may feel uncomfortable.
Thank you, Iliyan. So much there, right? Like, wow. But what really struck me was even thinking about the conflicts that occur culturally, even within the same organization, but across different countries, the way we are culturally raised and our perspectives. And then you go between companies. So when you think about conflict in the workplace, let's go with within a company, but working globally. What are some of the most common areas of conflicts, Iliyan, that arise?
Yeah, there is really a few of those. I would say the most common one stems from difference in opinion, particularly if you are in a competitive environment. And this can be anything from discussing the objectives of the group for the next month to things that are much more sensitive, such as annual performance reviews and so on. The second point, or the second cause, is around miscommunication. Oftentimes, conflicts may arise because someone was made aware of something else that has happened in the organization, and that was communicated to them through indirect channels. An example would be, John told me that you have asked for X, Y, and Z, or you have said that I have done such and such things. And these are particularly difficult to handle if you are on the receiving side of such conflict, because you can really have someone storm into your office or by your desk and come up with an emotional articulation of a situation that you're not even aware of. So I would say being able to communicate properly and take a step back in situations like that is important. The other cause for conflict is poorly defined responsibilities and expectations from our role. It's having a good understanding of what a person is supposed to do is essential. And quite frankly, the interesting part is that even when you join a job relatively early on, and you have spent, let's say, a couple of years, a lot of the time, more senior people on the team and managers expect that you are able to manage the scope of what you're supposed to do, as well as the timeline. And this is primarily around to the extent there is lack of clarity, you need to step in and ask for this clarification. Lastly, I would say failure or underperformance, any way you would like to call it, is obviously a common reason for conflict. And again, a lot of it stems around poorly communicated expectations on what the person is supposed to do. Oftentimes, when people have clarity on what the expectations are, they do realize on their own that they are probably not doing as well, so they reach out for advice and counsel. But if there is a misalignment on that, oftentimes both sides are kind of caught surprised in that situation.
Thank you so much there. And I love that there's really a difference in the expectations. And Rebecca, if we think about whether it's work or whether it's college or family, what do you see from your perspective as the main differences in the types of conflict?
Right. So I really like this question. I often use these comparisons as an example to stress to people that we're not always restricted to one response to conflict. Some people have an assumption that just because they avoid in a certain situation means that they're always going to avoid, and that's kind of plagues them and stops them from being able to be more open and collaborate. There's a model that's developed. I'm hoping to be a bit interactive with this. There's a model developed by Thomas Kilman, and it introduces people to 5 different types of conflict modes. So as I'm going through the list, I'm wondering if people can maybe in the chat just type in the one that they relate to most, and there might be one that piques your interest or maybe you feel it resonates with you. So the first one is avoidance. So it's low assertive, low cooperativeness. The second one is accommodation. It's low assertiveness and high cooperativeness. The third is compromise. It's mid assertiveness and mid cooperativeness. Competition is high assertiveness and low cooperativeness. And collaboration, which is high assertiveness and high cooperativeness. So there are avoidance, accommodation, compromise, collaboration, and competition. So I don't know if in the chat you want to just maybe write the one that you feel resonates with you or just share that if you feel comfortable. But when I list them, I think that people often think about how they respond differently at work versus at home with their family. So whereas you might perhaps in your sibling relationship, often this is the case, be very competitive, your relationship to your child might be to compromise with them because you've had a very long day and you just want to be able to, relax or have dinner. With your manager, for instance, you may avoid because you don't want to stir the pot or create a bad reputation. With your team members, you might collaborate because that's the environment that you work in and that's how you get stuff done. So it's important to think about conflict as highly contextual, and we think about how these are 5 different modes. There are probably others along with them, but we do move and we are flexible in terms of how we respond to conflict based on the environment and the people who are involved. So at home or at work, our existing relationships or our past relationships, future relationships with people, that creates some difference. Safety is really important. I know that, for instance, at work, do you feel safe enough in your position to be able to be assertive or to contradict someone or address a conflict without facing consequences? Is there a repercussion, for instance, professionally, if that happens? Or maybe even with a family member, maybe you'll be on someone's bad book if you try and raise an issue or address a conflict. Time and patience are key. You can't get to that epitome of conflict management, collaboration, high assertiveness, and high cooperativeness if you don't have a lot of patience and you don't have time, because you have to invest in a lot of trust, relationship building, creative thinking. Collaboration is probably the most time and patience intensive form of conflict management, and people often underestimate how long that takes. But it could also be just very basically, did you have your morning coffee? If you are feeling good, if you are feeling awake and alive and ready to start the day, you might be a little bit more open to having a conversation with someone if you haven't, right? Haven't had that cup of coffee and you're not totally awake yet. So just think about, when we're coming to this question about how environments and people influence the way that we deal with conflict, think about how you respond differently as an individual to so many people in your lives and how many different environments you're in and how you respond differently. That self-reflection, I think, is really important when it comes to developing our own conflict management practices and working on skill development. You may be consistent across the board, but my assumption is that many people do actually have, some flexibility and do relate to people differently depending on where they're at, how they're feeling, and if they've had their morning coffee. So I'm curious to see what's in the chat. Thank you for people who participated, but it's just
We had a lot of collaboration. We had some people saying accommodation. We had people saying ignore, avoid. So that's how we respond. And Joanne, I'm really interested if you've developed strategies for dealing with resolving conflict in everyday life. So I'd like to hear from you as well.
Every day, yeah. When it comes to me personally, it's always lots of fun. In terms of team, I'm a huge collaborator in terms of with our agile teams, trying to get them all working together. So personally, so at home, I'm actually working on doing things like team agreements with my own family to deal with conflict. So how do we agree to work with each other or be with each other? So I use a lot of different coaching practices actually with them to come up with a agreement as to how we want to be with each other. And that seems to help with a bunch of different expectations, like, how do we want to keep the house together? How do we want to keep, do we want to keep it tidy and neat all the time? And so how do we want to share this space together? So having all of those expectations out already, and that aligned understanding, helps reduce a lot of the conflict that we have in the house. It's not perfect, but that is one thing that we do work within our own house, is having that particular agreement. And it's the same thing I usually work with the teams too, to kind of get a team agreement going around how to handle conflict before the conflict arises, right? And it helps with the resolution and steps to get them to resolving conflict amongst themselves. And actually, the Thomas Kilmann conflict model, Rebecca, is the same one I use with my teams, and it's perfect. It works out really well, where they understand the mode that they're in when conflict comes to them. So yeah, that's what we do at home.
And that takes not only understanding sort of a model, but it comes with some skill development. And so open to Iliyan or Rebecca, what are the required skills that are needed to deal with conflict?
I can start off, and Rebecca, please follow on. So from my standpoint, I think patience and open mind is key. It's just the ability to listen in to what the other person has to say, even if your initial reaction is to bring up a lot of arguments, and they can be quite rational and to the point about why what you're hearing is not correct or not aligned with your point of view. The second is really being able to separate the cause of the problem from the person. Sometimes when we have worked with people over a long period of time, we tend to build up certain stereotypes about them. Jack always does X, Y, and Z. Anna would never listen to this and that. I think it's difficult when you have worked with someone for a long time not to have that, but if you feel that a situation is arising towards a conflict, really focus on what is the cause in this instance, and try not to carry with you any historical baggage, so to speak. And lastly, I think it's very important to be prepared to give in, even if for you at this point, even if at this point for you it's not necessarily the most truthful thing to do, but saying to someone, okay, I see your point on that question. I would really appreciate to understand better what you meant by X, Y, and Z. One gives the opportunity for the other person to be heard, and practice can really change the way people behave and their desire to make a compromise. So these are probably some of the things I would focus on in a situation of conflict.
I love when you said, really being able to separate the person from what's going on. Sort of in my world, I would call that clean your own windshield before you go in, right? Get rid of all the preconceptions that you have and go in with an open mind, and prepare to give in. And yeah, that comes with, how do you know when to take a stand and when to walk away? And I'm wondering, Joanne, do you want to take that one?
When do you take a stand, and when do you actually
walk away? Yeah. When are you prepared just to walk away from a conflict?
That's a very, I think it weighs into the impact of walking away and what you accept to walk away. So me personally, walking away, I would have to sit there and decide, is that situation better off? I don't want to be, I think it comes down to weighing the actual impact It really does. It's just like walking away. It like if I walk away, it's better for that situation or whatever is taking place than it is for it. It doesn't put me at jeopardy as well, but it's just walking away, leaving both of us in a better place, right? So I will weigh out things to sit there and say, do I really need to worry about this right now? Is this the right time? Nope, not the right time. That may be a good way to walk away from it right now. Or maybe I walk away because I don't have enough information to deal with that situation right now. But if I do have enough information, I will want to continue in with the conversation. But also, like I said, I like to get and understand everyone else's perspectives to see what else is there, because in understanding the different perspectives, it's not just my perspective, but collectively what's happening in this space so that we can resolve that particular conflict. Because a lot of times what I think or what I'm expecting, that may not be correct, right? So yeah, so that's I think that's the reason why I would walk away, is when I feel that it's not enough. Maybe I don't have enough information. It's not the right time, or it's not really worth it. There's not benefit to it. Oh, we can't hear you. You're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you, Joanne. Sorry, trying to mute out all the bird sounds in my background that you're going to hear. Yeah, so thank you for that. Like really knowing when is it worth it? When do you have a stake in the ground? When do you have to just back off or stay engaged? I'm really curious if there's a difference in how the genders between male and female handle conflict. And in this context, it's how people identify themselves to society, not necessarily even their birth gender. So, Rebecca, can you take that one?
Absolutely. This is a question that I think is very important, not just because of the gender question, but also the consideration of all the other identities that we have and that we operate in society with as individuals. I do think that, yes, it does impact how we deal with conflict. My response, the first part of it has to do kind of with what was brought up before about socialization. So our response to conflict is typically socialized. If we think about how we were raised, for instance, that usually does inform the approach that we have when we are confronted with a conflict. So for instance, if we were raised to believe that, stepping back and letting the person with greater authority come in and take command of the situation, it's going to be very uncomfortable for us to go against that instinct. This is true for gender. Typically, women do associate with being accommodating or avoiding in workplaces. It's also true for us culturally. Some cultures prefer indirect versus direct kinds of communication. So these are all very important considerations when we think about how individuals deal with conflict and how their socialization is impacting their approach. Secondly, I think that also how we're perceived in a conflict based on our identity also informs our approach and the response of other people. So those two things I think operate in tandem. We are familiar with the assumptions that govern perceptions of women, for instance, and men, for instance, in conflict. There is a sense that in male-dominated workplaces or workforces, there's a hesitancy around women wanting to bring up an issue or raise a conflict for fear of feeling like people think they're irrational or emotional or too sensitive. This perception of women in conflict does make it difficult for those issues to be raised in some occasions. So it's also important, I think, when discussing this, to consider how racialized individuals are also impacted by perception when conflicts arise. This is incredibly important just based on what is happening in the world right now, conversations about anti-Black racism. My perception to the world as a white woman, for instance, when I was walking into small claims court to do mediation, is very different from that of my racialized colleagues. People are attuned to the societal privilege that you have in the world at large, and that does impact their response to you in a situation and their willingness to work with you and willingness to listen to you, or not characterize you as being overly emotional or angry, for instance. So I think when we're talking about conflict in workplaces, it's very important to consider these elements as well. Your identity, your race, your class, your gender, your sexuality, everything. It does impact the way that you are able or capable or can handle a situation based on how people perceive you as such. So I think there's no real one rule book. There are these wonderful texts that have inspired a lot of conflict management practice, but I think it's very important that people consider all of the ways that they themselves have negotiated in their lives and in their careers. You are skilled and capable, regardless of whether you're an expert or whether you've read rule books. The best thing that you can do is to try and develop and adapt a strategy or an approach that works for you as who you are authentically and represents yourself well. So I am greatly inspired by all the tools and strategies in these books that we can read and I can talk about later. But I really hope that people can authentically come to a conflict and feel like they're representing themselves and not just adhering to a rule book when it comes to approaching conflict. So those are my thoughts on it. I could probably talk for an hour about this, so I'll cut myself off now before I get into that.
Oh, thank you so much. And Iliyan, I'm really curious, like, what do we do if the conflict is not resolvable? Like, you got two people there or two sides, and they're both opposing. What happens then?
Yeah, indeed, this is a tough situation and not quite uncommon. What I would say is that the best option in a situation like that is to give time. Try to call off the current meeting in an amicable way and say that you have learned a lot of things that are, we have discussed the question that's really important to both of us. We have spent a good amount of time discussing it. It seems that the best course of action at this point of time is just to give it a day and think about it. I think oftentimes in the heat of the moment, and the heat of the moment can easily be 2 hours, we get entrenched in our position and we need to take some time away from that situation that put us into this conflict and we can't find a resolution. Step away from it, think of it in other circumstances, cool off, maybe even consult with friends of ours or friends and family. And oftentimes that actually makes people realize that what has been so important for them at this point, they can give in a little bit and they can compromise. Oftentimes, it's also a question of us just going and doing a little bit more research. Maybe we were presented with facts we were not aware of, but we acted a little bit defensive at the moment, and we're like, oh, shoot, I actually didn't realize that that body of knowledge or that study existed, but I don't want to admit that this was my omission, so I will continue to stand my ground. So again, just even saying, look, I would benefit from taking a couple of days to research some of the points that you raised, is a good way to not lose face, but at the same time also demonstrate to the other person that you have taken their point seriously. You want to give it thought, and then most often than not, the other person also reciprocates. Leaving conflicts unresolved for too long, though, I don't think, in my experience, is a good idea. If you postpone a follow-up discussion by more than 2 weeks, people sometimes just decide, you know what, it's not worth it. But they hold a little bit of a grudge deep inside. So to the extent you can, try find a way to resolve a conflict, but understand that very often this will not happen in that particular meeting on that particular day.
And so it's really about validating what you're hearing from the other side, acknowledging what you're learning in the moment, and allowing some space to digest it, to walk away and say, okay, there's some new information here. I want some time to digest it. But to your point, don't let it go too long, because otherwise people become disinterested. So thank you for that. Switching gears a little bit, thinking about teams and leading teams. When you're working on a team and there's different opinions there, so you're not with a different company, you're on the same team. Iliyan, is there any difference in how you would handle that conflict on teams?
Yeah, in general, conflict and even getting a step earlier, which is just the difference of opinion. There is an interesting situation that I have noticed through training and through practice. When you ask most people what do they prefer from their seniors and even their peers, most people will say, we definitely appreciate frank feedback. We want people to be straight up to us, and this is great because I can learn very quickly. However, if you take then the same people and you put them in a situation where they role play and they are provided this direct feedback in one situation, and then in another situation they are provided a much more supportive feedback, in the huge majority of cases, people are much more supportive of the supportive feedback, despite the fact that they indicated something else. So when you're part of a team that puts you in this tricky situation of a colleague of yours says, let's do X, Y, and Z, and you feel strongly that this is not the right path, how do you do that? There have been some, I don't want to sort of underplay the importance, but almost language tricks in which people are saying you should not use but or however. An older approach has been the so-called Oreo sandwich, where even if you hear something that you don't agree with, you started with something positive, then you provide your constructive feedback, and then you move on to something, you end up again on a positive note. Another thing that is brought up today is really, as opposed to using but or have you considered and so on, to use yes and. I personally have had some mixed experience with these things because it is great at avoiding conflict. It is very good at making people articulate more of their opinions. However, the challenge is if you need to get a team on the same page in a really short timeline, this sort of ambiguity where people will leave the meeting and they will be thinking, okay, like I expressed my opinion, there were some additional thoughts I could consider, but by and large, I felt that everyone was supportive of what I was saying. And then three days or worse, 3 weeks down the road, they have done a lot of work and they go to that same group meeting and everyone is like, well, that's not really what it should have been. Obviously, it's not a good outcome. So basically, the recommendation is depending on the urgency of the matter, you should play with the transparency of your feedback, and if essential, you need to make it clear that you stand somewhere else, highlight what are the key risks of taking the path that is being outlined, and basically make it clear to everyone what your position is.
Thank you so much. And, the last year and a half, I've been playing in an agile environment at the company I'm at, and we've really gotten very good at how we give transparent feedback. I'm not going to chime in. I'm going to turn it over to Joanne and say, Joanne, when you're in an agile environment, how is conflict different or not, and how do you handle it?
Yeah, so I would sit there and say that because of the nature of Agile, I don't know if a lot of people here know what Agile is, but what we try and do with Agile is we have teams basically who are working with each other, and used to be before COVID-19 face-to-face. So they were, we would situate people to work 9 to 5 every day. They'd be working together, and they weren't, a lot of these, and a lot of larger organizations that I've worked with, they're not used to doing that. So all of a sudden they're sitting beside someone really close to them that is with them. And so it becomes really apparent really quite quickly that conflict arises, because you can see it in people's faces all the time. So they're just like, they're all of a family living inside a house. You can see it, you can feel it, it's there. So what happens is with these particular teams, we end up having to deliberately come in and talk about conflict, and deliberately creating resolution paths. How are we going to resolve the conflict within the particular team? So we will get conflict a lot more. We'll see it a lot more. You'll feel a lot more. And there's tools and techniques that we use from an Agile perspective that's called like retrospectives, which I think you're very much familiar with. So which allows us to actually make these conflicts more transparent. And so we see it as frequent as we do them, which we do once a week or so, where we identify what's working, what's not working, what do we want to stop. And in those conversations, we do start to see a lot of the conflicts or differences of opinions come. So because we're able to do this within the process of what we have, we're able to actually reduce a lot of the conflicts, but still conflicts arise. And when conflicts do happen within these particular teams, we have a resolution agreement, and we'll often go into, and because we like to make everything very transparent and visible, we'll typically, what I like to do with the group is I'll get them to actually write up what their assumptions are. I'll get them to write it up on a board so we can make it all visible, understand, what is it that the goal we're trying to do as a team to get towards, what is the purpose of helping to resolve that particular conflict. And that seems to help them with actually going through and resolving that particular conflict. And there's other methods that we use from an Agile perspective to get them through that. But there is a lot of, I see quite often a lot more conflict in teams. And so it requires us all to be aware of it. And so the agreements and resolution of how we do it really helps.
And, that's all about being transparent on the team, and a lot of self-managed teams in Agile. What's the role of a leader, either in the Agile environment or Iliyan and the corporate environment? What's the role of a leader when there's conflict in a team? And I'll open that up to both of you.
If I would sit there and say, because actually we were talking about this today, which is pretty interesting. So because the Agile teams are supposed to be self-organized. So we're actually asking the team to actually resolve the conflict themselves. And so before bringing in the manager. So which is different than most managers used to. They're not used to having that. They're used to actually, as soon as my employee has a particular issue, I'm going to work with them and work with the other member or whatever their technique is. So now we're asking them actually to shift, hold off, let the team figure it out first. Like, let the kids figure it out, right? Before we start to figure it out, we'll let them to figure it out before it gets escalated to them. So it can be a real big shift for them. And actually, I think it's really good for them too, to be able to allow the team to actually figure out how to resolve it.
Yeah. Thank you, Iliyan. Your perspective.
Yeah, I would say it's really a continuation of what Joanne said. I think the hardest decision for a leader is to know when to step in a conflict and try to either cut out a person or let sort of some of these opinions and some of these differences of opinion be aired and get out there. It is, from my standpoint, it is tricky. I think where you are on the spectrum will depend a lot on the maturity of your team, how long they have worked together, how comfortable they feel with each other. And there is another element which sort of appears when you migrate from difference of opinions to conflict. When you start approaching conflict, some people get some of the statements they make are not necessarily productive to anyone. And I feel that this is a situation where if a manager does not step in, that may embolden others around the table to pitch in with similar comments, which can be unprofessional, insensitive, whatever the case might be. And I think there is a clear separation there where if this is a difference of opinion which is expressed professionally, absolutely, let's give this time and let's think about it. But if people are getting unprofessional, the managers and the senior leadership needs to step in very promptly and make it clear that this is not tolerated. Again, sometimes then managers sort of jump into the other extreme, which Joanne was speaking about, when a manager will interrupt the person so long as he or she feels that sort of the way of thinking and the reasoning is counter to where they stand. And this is obviously not the right approach, because then people feel that they're just following, or there is a lot of cooler talk where people don't express things in a broader setting, but then during lunch or so on. So it doesn't really create a good team dynamic where people know they can openly discuss issues.
Thank you so much, all of you. One last question, which is open to anyone on the panel, which is tell us about an episode when you had an issue with a coworker or disagreed with your boss. And, what was the situation? What did you do? And what was the outcome? And then we'll turn it over to Q&A.
I don't mind sharing slightly embarrassing story. So one of my first jobs, I was a medical administrator at a busy doctor's office. And there was a confusion with an appointment. I had called a patient and offered them an appointment, but they had never called me back to confirm it. They assumed that the appointment had been booked. They came in irate that the appointment slot wasn't available, and my boss at the time, the doctor in charge, invited me into the office for public reprimanding, even though in that situation I knew in my heart of hearts that I hadn't done anything wrong. But what was fortunate in that situation was that I had kept a very detailed notebook every single day of everything that I did. And if an issue was resolved or not, I would cross it out if it was. And if it wasn't, I wouldn't cross it out. And I had made detailed notes. And so later that day, I was able to present them to my boss, and it was issued an apology as well, which is always good. And it was a sincere one as well, which was even better. But it reminded me in that moment, and it taught me very early that keeping notes and having, to use another phrase, a paper trail, can be very helpful when you're in situations where there might later down the line be a disagreement, or there might be a miscommunication. We talk a lot about how that's one of the primary sources of conflict in workplaces. It sometimes feels uncomfortable to use words like paper trail when you're talking about interacting with your colleagues and maybe even your managers or people that you are maybe a little bit, unsure about your relationship with. But it is advantageous to make sure that you get things in writing, whether that is in a memo or whether it is in an email chain, or whether it is in a paper notebook that you keep by your desk all the time. I find that is something that just really provides you with the information power that you need just in case you end up in conflict. So that's something that I learned very early on. And to this day, I always have a notebook in front of me just in case. But
Thanks, Rebecca. I think along with, making sure that you have your ducks in a row, but it's also this integrity of standing up and sharing your own perspective. So, from the perspective of the patient, they thought they had an appointment. From the office perspective, she hadn't called back. And so this is where the conflict arises, but you need to be able to speak up for yourself at the same time in a way that's not casting blame. Like I see how you see it. This is how we see it. There is a conflict here. How will we resolve it? So thank you for that. Joanne, were you going to chime in on that question as well?
Yeah, it's kind of funny you're saying how there's one situation with one of my actual VPs at one of the companies that I was working at, where I did get into a situation from a conflict with her in terms of her wanting me to move her into her department. And I was adamant. I came with all the data and the facts as to why she should not move me into her department. And I stood up for myself, like, nope, you cannot do that. I talked to my other director, the director that I had, and in the end, she actually moved me into the department, which was really quite frustrating. I was really happy and grateful that I stood up for myself, and actually how it resolved is I left the company. But, and I think this speaks to Rebecca, I came to that position beforehand knowing what I wanted. And I had my data and the fact, and I stood up for what I believed in, even though the situation didn't go the way that I wanted to go the way that I wanted to be. I actually just went, okay, great, thank you very much. I followed whatever happened and left afterwards. So it was unfortunate, but that's just, that's some of the situations that can occur. Oh, you're on mute again.
Thank you. Iliyan, any comments from you as well?
No, not really a lot more to add to some of these good examples.
Thank you. So we're at the top of the hour, and in this hour that we've had together, we talked about sort of conflict in the workplace, the causes of conflict, strategies for managing conflict, and then conflict in teams. And we have half an hour left. We want to open it up for Q&A. So I just, you are welcome to put your questions into chat or to unmute yourself and show us your camera and come on in and direct your questions to any one of our three panelists. That would be great.
I have a question, and I have my camera on also. If that's okay.
Welcome, Ellen. Nice to see you. What's your question?
Nice to see you all. First of all, thank you, WSTEM, for allowing men for the first time. This is great. And so my question would be, I'm coming from the world of teams, and obviously a lot of conflicts around teams, because that's a part of life. I guess I want to ask, when would you address a conflict with the whole team, and when would you take the personal one-on-one with just one of the team members? Just a rule of thumb, how to figure that one out.
I can try and answer a bit on. I'm in this situation right now, to tell you the truth. I think taking it on as a team, you have to feel that people are safe to do that. So if you feel that as a team, people will feel unsafe to be able to actually express themselves, or they can't really be their authentic selves for whatever reason, I wouldn't want to put people in a very uncomfortable position. It's going to be uncomfortable, but if they feel very unsafe to answer, then I wouldn't take it to the team. I would go individual first. Or, if you were going to do it from a team perspective, have a person who can handle it, an entire team. It can be really effective if you can do it with the whole team, that's for sure. I think it also depends on how skilled you are to do it too.
Yeah, it's a real catch-22, because in order to build trust, how you handle conflict and how you give each other feedback in a team environment builds trust. But you got to start with baby steps, right? So it's complicated. Thank you for that question. What other questions do we have for any of the panelists?
I'd love to hear what Rebecca would like to, or Ilya has to respond to that question too.
We have a question coming in here that says, what would be special about conflict resolution when it's with your boss? So when your boss and you are in a bit of a conflict at work, opening it up to anyone on the panel here.
Thank you. So I can see there's a recognition.
So sorry, I will just provide my view on dealing with conflict on the team. I would agree with Rebecca and maybe go even one more step further in suggesting that unless you know that this person is going to handle it well in a public setting, do it one-on-one. For some reason, and I have sometimes learned that the hard way. My view has been from a purely objective standpoint, it is nice to share some constructive feedback in a public setting, such that everyone on the team can get an understanding of what is important for the lead, for the team, whatever the case might be. But over the years, I have consistently received the feedback that on average, a safer approach, like a rule of thumb, as Alan, as you mentioned, is try to take sensitive matters one-on-one. As it relates to disagreement with your boss, I personally don't think that there is a huge difference of how I handle that versus any other member on the team. Clearly, you have to be probably one step more professional and sensitive. I think it's important to appreciate the fact that sometimes managers have a different perspective, and this may not be because they are any different than us, but they may be aware of things that we are not. They may have objectives different than ours. And so there needs to be sort of that additional understanding that they just have a different mindset, and understanding where they're coming from and sharing your concerns about the particular situation and letting them hear it out and think about it is probably the best strategy. I think trying to persuade someone will depend on the situation. Ultimately, they have to hear your reasons, and give that some time is the approach that I have taken. I can't say, unfortunately, that it has always worked. So clearly open to getting better at this.
If I could briefly just add to that, I echo everything that was just said. And I think also, as I was saying at the beginning, if you spend time preparing for these conversations by thinking about the other person's interests, that is so valuable, because it helps you frame your discussion, and it helps you come up with points that you know will be agreeable to the person. You can frame your concerns in a way that appeal to their interests, their needs, their concerns as a manager. Trying to do that dual perspective taking, as was mentioned, is so crucial, and it can really make you come across more favorably for bringing up an issue. And as was mentioned before too, kind of the Oreo effect, like trying to maybe layer your conversation so that you're affirming, you're validating, you're saying things that you have in common and everything that you respect and appreciate about what's happening going forward. And then you are able to introduce this concern that you have. Framing it in that way can be really helpful, I think, and people respond well to hearing their interests reflected back to them. It reflects well on you as too, I think.
Thank you.
And still keeping it within the team, is there a way that you can help someone change their style? So you mentioned earlier that there are different styles and people manage conflicts in a different way. Can you help if you think it will be more effective for the team?
So Daphne, just to clarify, you're saying if someone, for instance, has a tendency to accommodate, but you think collaboration would be more beneficial to the team, for instance?
For example, yes.
Yeah, for example. Yeah, I think that takes, like, as we've reiterated time and time again in this discussion, a lot of trust and relationship building. You have to be in a place where you can have those conversations that often require more effort, more time, more patience, and more openness. All those skills that were mentioned before. Being able to create that environment takes time in itself before you can even get to the part where you're encouraging them to adopt a style that may not be comfortable for them. With collaboration, it often involves sharing ideas. They want to make sure that they feel like their ideas are actually being heard or appreciated, or that they're going to be incorporated at some point. If they have a tendency to accommodate or avoid, maybe that hasn't ever been a situation they've experienced. So trying to make it, as was mentioned by the two other panelists, a positive team environment where this is a trusting environment too. I think that that's really key before anyone can change or feel comfortable changing their approach.
And then we have a question coming in that relates to teams and relates to Agile. So through the team retrospectives, that's where conflict should be brought forward. But any tips in an Agile environment on dealing with conflicts that are identified in the team retro?
That are identified in the team retro itself. So I don't know who asked the question. Maybe I'll have to assume if it's like a personal conflict or a conflict that I can assume it's a personal conflict.
So Joanne, I can come off mute. While it was in my head, I wanted to just get it out.
Yeah.
So because oftentimes in a retrospective, you can identify where there's potential sources of conflict, and it could be like solution-oriented conflict. It could be personal conflict. It could be process-related conflict. And so, if it's conflict that is maybe pertinent, well, regardless of the conflict, I guess my question is, regardless of the conflict, should it be addressed within the team if there's conflict that's brought up in a retrospective? Because then it's made public. The conflict is on the table.
So what I tend to do is I tend to, like, again, I see conflict as there's a gold nugget that's in there, right? So it's like a voice that needs to be heard. So what I'll tend to do is I'll often will name that there seems to be a bit of conflict happening here, right? Just to name and then I will, if the team is, feel okay, great. So if we have a conflict resolution agreement, okay, well, what's our steps that we need to go through? Like we agreed, we called out the conflict. Okay, what's our next step that we need to do? So I'll often get them to go through that. If they don't have that, I'll often try to work with, like, what's the assumptions that we're making here? Because a lot of times it has to do with assumptions and or expectations that I've seen on teams. They expected the solution was this, they expected the time was this, they expected this person's role was this, or assumed it was going to be this and all that kind of stuff. So I try and work through what are the assumptions that, what are you making up that, about this thing that's causing the conflict, right? So I try and get that to come out so that we can then have that conversation. And if the conflict is heated, like Iliyan was talking about, like I will often go 24-hour rule, right? This is just like, even my girls are hockey players, so that was what the coaches would do too. It's like 24-hour rule, let's come back the next day to talk about it.
Okay, especially if you got a team that's working together ongoing, right? And so
for sure,
it could be time out, sleep on it, come back.
Yeah. Call it out, I think it's really important too, right? So that they recognize it, and getting them used to actually calling it out so that they can do something with it, right?
Okay, thank you.
And I love what you said, Joanne, which is really, what are the assumptions that we're making? What are the expectations that we have? Where are we aligned and not aligned? It goes back to what was said earlier, what's our position and what's our interest?
Yeah.
I love that.
And the one thing I'd like to add to it is just be curious, right? I think my assumption is that everyone's taking this from a positive perspective, that no one's trying to harm anybody else. So trying to be very curious and non-judgmental in the situation is really, really important, especially as coaches. We have to model that type of stance.
Thank you so much. Here's an interesting question. How do you approach advocating and supporting colleagues that are in conflicts, but they don't directly involve you, right? So your colleague comes to you and says, I'm in a conflict, blah, 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 blah. So this is open to anyone on the panel.
I can start. I think it's actually a great opportunity for someone who is not part of the conflict to try and mediate, because he or she doesn't really carry any of that emotional burden. And I think any other participant in that conflict will have a more open ear to that. So I would say, a lot of people, in my experience, will be willing to take on this role. So don't hesitate to reach out, particularly in tightly teams. In my experience, this is great, and oftentimes is one of the paths to resolve a conflict. It's actually a great addition. I forgot to mention that, but I would use it as much as I could.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Iliyan. Here's a question that's coming in. When you have a coworker or a boss who habitually crosses the line of respect and responds with attacks when conflict is there. So they go right into attack mode, right? Like how does one put limits on what we will accept and not accept around respectful behavior, I think is the question. Open to
The one thing I want to point out is that there's when people are doing that, it's an edge behavior, right? That's being hit. And usually it's because you're going from a place of comfortable to something that's uncomfortable, right? So note that when you see that in an individual, because that's the state that they're typically going in.
And so you call it the edge behavior because they're falling over the edge, right? They've been triggered. They've been triggered. Yeah. And so, you know, from my perspective, there's this, wow, something's really shifted here. You know, what's showing up for you right now? Like, I can't label it. I'm not going to say, well, that's disrespectful behavior. It's just like, what's showing up for you right now? And if they can't engage, it's like maybe there's a timeout and we'll engage later. But really just noticing the shifts and commenting on them. Yeah.
I mean, if it's a habitual type of behavior, I think Iliyan was talking about that, like that. The manager or someone will need to come in to have a discussion, because it's not an acceptable workplace behavior. But I want to be compassionate about individuals that are like that. It is because there's something within them that it's just they're uncomfortable about it, and that's how it's showing up, right? And it's just that one behavior. But the thing is that triggers off, like Iliyan was talking about, triggers off all these other behaviors in the team, which isn't really healthy, right? So bringing in, you know, someone who can actually work with an individual like that may be required.
Yeah, and just in terms of using or turning to objective criteria, that's something that is often referred to in situations where you feel like you don't have a lot of power or control. What are the policies, or, you know, if it gets to that point, what are the policies or the regulations or rules that are either written down or not that you can turn to that set behavior or set standards in a workplace? You know, that could be something that was in your contract. It could be something you could, you know, look up or have a conversation with someone who works in HR or something like that. It's just to know that there are typically structures that are in place to protect you. To know what resources those are and how to locate them can be helpful. If you are at that point where you just have nowhere else to turn, you've tried interpersonal resolution and it just keeps happening. I think just knowing about objective criteria generally whenever we're in conflict, it's like, what can you turn to that anyone would see is just objectively written down? It's not subjective. It's just like, these are the rules. Being able to know what that is in a conflict can be very helpful too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you. I have no more chat questions coming in, but if anyone has a question that's on their mind, just unmute yourselves, ask our panelists. We'd love to hear from you. We have about 13 minutes left before we call it an evening. Okay, here's one coming into chat. Some cultures are less prone to conflict. How can you help someone from this kind of background to open up? Yeah, like I'm working with Asia right now, and they don't want to speak up and challenge, right? Like culturally, there's this don't speak up and challenge, and yet there's so much benefit to speaking up and challenge. How do you help, or just how do you collaborate with people from different cultures?
I think the first thing for me is typically knowing that is that type of mode that is happening with that type of culture, and if they are more in, like, they could be more in that accommodating type of mode, in which case I often get really clear about the information or the facts which are there. So that, you know, it's not like I can tell you from an IT perspective, one culture that I was working with was just, yeah, okay, we're going to do it. They're very accommodating, but it never got done, right? Because they never wanted to say they couldn't get it done. So what I would do is I would create structures which would basically ensure that I know that things are on track, or that would surface up that information so that, you know, a conflict wouldn't be created, right? So if I know that there's a culture like it's really hard to kind of move them over. Julie was saying, right, it takes a while to kind of build that safety and that trust and that feeling that they're not going to be judged, or whatever it is, the reason why that they're not going to be accommodating, or that they're not going to hit conflict bang on. So until that's done, I will put structures in place that'll help, so it reduces the ability to create conflict.
Yeah, what I would add on that is for circumstances when you either have people who have difficulty being open in a public setting, or just expressing in any way disagreement, is to really have and offer up to have one-on-one conversations where you ask for their opinion. Clearly, this can be quite time-consuming for the manager or whoever is doing that. So you need to ensure that you value this opinion, and that ultimately is going to help this person become more outspoken. The other thing for what Joanne was talking about, in a situation when people feel hesitant to indicate that certain deadline or scope of work is not practical, is to ask them, as opposed to saying, hey, do you think you can do A, B, and C by the end of the month, is to say, when do you think you can complete A, B, and C by, and then sort of see where you can work from there. All of these things, unfortunately, the challenge is that all of these things take time, and you need to understand when a person is thinking something differently from what they are saying, and it's not easy.
And that is the art of communication, right? That's the, it is an art. It is taking time to read the other person, what they're saying, what they're not saying, what their body language is telling you, what their hesitation might be telling you, what your intuition is telling you. So thank you for that. We have no more questions coming into chat. I'll give another quiet moment to see if any more questions come in, and then we'll wrap it up.
I have a question, actually. Is that allowed? Can a panelist ask?
It is.
To the panelists?
Yes.
I was wondering, in terms of texts that you've enjoyed or resources that you've enjoyed that you think others might or might find useful. We read books, we read texts, we watch videos or clips, and they could be really impactful. So I'm just wondering, if people want to continue their learning, what's a text that you can think of? I know I just saw in the corner of my eye one of the books, which I might go and reach across to see, but if anyone else has something. I know now Joanne's looking at her book.
I know, it's
all kind of
I'm sort of
there.
One of the ones was Humble Inquiry. Humble Inquiry is a really great book in terms of having conversations and how you can talk to other people. So that comes for me in terms of asking powerful questions and working with others to understand where they're coming from. And so it's mainly around powerful questions. So instead of asking yes, no, you get more information from them to understand what's underneath that particular conflict. So that's the first book that came up for me over here. I can find some others though.
And for me, a book I've read recently is Radical Candor, and it really gets to, when are we not discussing the undiscussables versus being terminally respectful, which is not healthy, being brutally honest, which can tear people down, versus being courageously authentic. And how do you use courageous authenticity to talk about the undiscussables? So Radical Candor, love it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if any I can think of one, but I can. There's one that I read a while ago. I should turn on my video so I can see if this is actually going to be on screen. It might be reversed for you, unfortunately, but I can read it. There you go. It's good. So it's Difficult Conversations, and it's a book that's just all about strategies and really a really practical guide to how to prepare yourself for conversations that will be difficult. That's something that we do a lot of training on in the university environment as students are negotiating power imbalances and trying to figure out how to have conversations with people who maybe culturally they have been told never to confront or never to have difficult conversations with. So it's any book that has to talk about that and offers practical tips and strategies, I think is really, really resourceful. So it's Difficult Conversations by Douglas Stone, Bruce Patton, and Iliyan. I think this is a really valuable text. And you can also turn to, like I myself am a conflict coach. And for some people, before they get into those situations, it can be very helpful to just bounce ideas off of someone or to be able to share your thoughts or practice. Conflict coaches are a great resource for people who, you read the book, but at the same time you feel like, I need to get this out. I need to hone my skills. Being able to work with somebody to do that is very helpful too, or even a friend. I think, it's one thing to read a lot. I have a couple degrees in English, so I never am opposed to reading a book, but practicing is another thing entirely.
What I'm really interested in is a conflict coach. I've never heard of a conflict coach before. So that's awesome. They exist. That's great.
Yeah, it's a really rewarding experience. We don't give advice. We don't tell people what to do. A lot of what we do is listen to people's stories and give them a safe place in order to talk about their experiences. In many cases, you don't want to talk about this. You don't want to show your vulnerability at work or in your family environment. So having someone you can chat to and just put it all on the table and then develop strategies to move forward. People often use conflict coaches before they go into mediation so that they're actually prepared to have these difficult talks. But also if they just are in a sticky situation and preparing to have a difficult conversation, for instance, with their family member or friend or coworker, conflict coaches can be very helpful in that respect. So yeah, a little plug for conflict coaches.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think it's great.
Good. Well, I would like to thank Joanne, Rebecca, and Iliyan for being on our panel this evening. Certainly engaging, really dynamic conversation. I hope everyone is taking a nugget away from tonight that they can apply in their personal life, their work life. And thank you for the WSTEM TO for really offering up this space and for Daphna for engaging all of us. We have a few comments coming in. This was great. Thanks for making it an open event. Thanks for a great panel and moderation. Thanks to our participants, right? It was so engaging because of your contribution as well. So thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you very much, Julie, and everyone, all the panelists, all the participants. This was a great discussion. I also want to thank the WSTEM TO team for organizing and preparing this event. So thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.